Dear Professor Mikhail Mikhailovich Reshetnikov and dear colleagues, it is a pleasure to address you in the opening of this course and an honor to share my experience with professionals deeply engaged in Freudian and Jungian tradition of psychotherapy in St. Petersburg. I'm particularly grateful to the director for this opportunity to contribute to your academic program. Personally, I have long been inspired by the history and richness of Russian psychological research and culture, and I'm eager to foster a spirit of exchange and mutual learning. My aim is not only to share the progress and challenges of my clinical practice, but also to listen, to collaborate, and to understand more deeply the perspectives and experience of my Russian colleagues. Today, I would like to begin by briefly outlining the evolution in scientific understanding that has led many clinicians, including myself, to approach psychotherapy from a broader perspective. In recent decades, development in psychiatry, psychology, and neuroscience have developed both the power and the limits of classical approaches. And while the insights of Freud and Jung remain foundational, clinical practice and research increasingly suggests the importance of transpersonal dimensions, those that address the search for meaning, questions of identity, and the evolution of consciousness itself. In this context, transpersonal psychotherapy represents not a break with tradition, but its extension, an integration of scientific rigor with the wisdom of depth psychology and the realities of human experience that reach beyond the personal mind. As we move into the main part of this presentation, I hope to share concrete examples from my work, including a clinical case that highlights the value of transpersonal methods when combined with modern psychiatric and psychodynamic treatment. I will try to offer not only theoretical reflections, but also a practical sense of how psychotherapy and psychiatry in today's world can respond more fully to the profound needs that patient brings to our offices. Let's start then with an outline of the integration of transpersonal psychotherapy in modern psychiatric and psychodynamic approaches, and this is intended all for Jungian and Freudian therapists. This is the clinical case. I would like to present a clinical case that shows the value of integrating transpersonal psychotherapy with modern psychiatric and psychodynamic approaches. The patient, let's call him RB, is a man of around 50 whom I have followed for several years. He showed intense depression and anxiety, particularly after the death of his mother. His diagnosis was obsessive-compulsive personality disorder with borderline obsessive-compulsive disorder, intermittent psychotic features, and occasional suicidal ideation. Brief background. RB held a job and never had a job and left law school halfway through. He never had a girlfriend and was entirely dependent on his mother for emotional and material support. The father abandoned the family when RB was a child and provided no financial assistance, and the mother, a lawyer with neurotic and probably obsessive traits herself, died in a car accident. A younger brother, who suffered from psychotic problems, had previously died by suicide. My role as a public psychiatrist working in a national health department was to offer neuroleptic and hypnotic medications, help him receive a disability pension, and provide ongoing regular psychological support. Medications helped RB to sleep and slightly reduced his anxiety during acute crisis, but he remained prone to decompensation, frequent destabilization. At first, even supportive psychotherapy was not only not well received, though he soon formed a very strong attachment to me, but his style was obsessively dependent on references, figures, and depressive thoughts. He couldn't let go of the trauma of losing his mother and brother, not because he loosened his attachment to me. During the initial and darkest also phase, by then in private practice after my retirement, our therapy seemed mostly supportive. He would often cry in the sessions, ruminating obsessively over perceived injustices that he, his mother, and family had suffered at the hands of relatives, institutions, and his father mostly. He strove to see himself as a just man who refused to hate his enemies, yet in the same session he would launch into bitter tirades against them, full of hysterical laughter and fantastical revenge scenarios, before plunging back into severe depression. Over time, we managed to discuss and explore his life at least a little bit, his relationship and inner world more deeply. But R.B. struggled with associative processes and couldn't accept any interpretations. He remained unaware of his thought attachments or his part in the dynamic. Throughout our work, there was little substantive change, and he failed to recognize the meaning or reasons for his dissociative projections. For instance, he repeatedly identified absolute adversaries, such as his legal lawyer, a bad father figure, and idealized others like myself, a good father, or distant friends. And when it came to women, all but his mother, whom he continually mourned and idealized as a saintly figure, were deeply negative, or so idealized as to be unattainable. Discussing his obvious dissociations never led to clinical improvement. The work was often discouraging. As common with such cases, the patient seemed not to truly want to get better, analysis dragged on endlessly, and sessions became repetitive. He was resistant to dream interpretation, to exploring projections, or even following basic behavioral suggestions, for example, simple acts of self-care like hygiene, cooking, or cleaning the house. Still, gradually, there were improvements. With state support, R.B. managed to live alone in a small house near the city. He hired a woman for cleaning, though often quarreled with her, always seeing her as negative. He even made small journeys to meet distant friends of his mother, forming new bonds and considering moving northwards. He looked more after his home, enrolled also in an English course, began using a computer, and regularly attended church prayers at church and at home also. He valued very much our sessions, which eventually became a little less frequent. R.B. remained dutiful and trusted me, eagerly anticipating each meeting and at times sharing dreams. These dreams revealed his dissociation, his Christian aspirations, contrasted with intense scenes of revenge in the dreams and cosmic rage, fantasies of gruesome violence inflicted on his enemies, which he would relate with prolonged, almost sadistic, cathartic laughter. Yet over time, awareness of his dissociation began to grow. He spoke less in the sessions, allowing me to speak more. He no longer filled the entire meeting mourning his neurosis and depression. At times he allowed me to guide him, albeit briefly, into more detached states of consciousness, before returning to lament his negative view of life from his ego point of view. More recently, on a few occasions, he succeeded in longer mental and emotional relaxation exercises, a sort of immersion in the mental space which also always lingers between thoughts, which I use to introduce and facilitate non-dual states of consciousness during the sessions. In those moments, I encouraged him to notice, beyond simply tuning into my consciousness, his own inner state. Earlier, R.B. had found it almost impossible to shift states of consciousness even momentarily, but over more recent work, such transitions became less difficult. In a recent session, he succeeded even in remaining in a relaxed, quiet state for an unusually long time. He experienced a sense of lightness and well-being he hadn't felt in years. Guided by me, he noticed his breath and the gentle, beneficial current flowing through his body, as though cleansing him from within, new sensations of pleasure and connection. At our most recent session, he entered already more peaceful and wished to repeat the experience. He described himself as feeling fundamentally calmer, as he said, like a bottle once full of dirty water and now empty, or rather filled with air, transparent, an emptiness filled with tranquility, lightness, almost a subtle joy. Thoughts of his negative father had receded. He no longer felt wounded as before, he said. It was as if something negative had fallen away. He kept saying, "Now I look beyond." As he spoke about his newfound peace, I sensed the beneficial current in his subtle body and thus asked what he felt. He described a strange tingling, which upon reflection was more like a gentle flow of peace, similar to feeling a warm, pleasant sea breeze. Thoughts still came and went, but he felt above them. His suffering and the pains of his past no longer hurt as before. It was as though he finally had accepted that what had happened could not be changed, but it didn't matter like before. During the week, he noticed that this distance and calmness, less intense but persistent. He heard an inner voice telling him in his anxiety moments, stay calm, be patient, don't get discouraged when difficult thoughts arose. Throughout our work, I had often encouraged him to avoid giving in to obsessive thought loops, to refrain from getting on board with every thought stream, and to recognize the relationship between thoughts and energy. It was as if, rather than standing in traffic, he now watched from the sidewalk. The thoughts passed by but didn't hit him directly. This was a significant change. Previously, he simply could not move into another consciousness state, not even briefly. Now, after years and perhaps as a result of my persistence and own confidence in eventual success, he wanted and was able to make this transition almost as if by a small miracle. We also reflected, as usual, during the session on his dreams and experiences with others, but this time from within this different state of consciousness. That shift made all the difference, and he could recognize this. One lingering doubt, though, was whether this improvement included just a bit of elevated mood or psychiatric excitement state alongside his increased awareness. For example, at the start of the session, he had made a joke in English and he had never done before and reported some new sleep difficulties. Thus, I decided also to slightly increase his sedative at night. So as you see, it is a multidimensional approach because this case demonstrates the importance of also taking care of the medical and psychiatric pharmacological situation, of the psychological dynamics, but also of the transpersonal states of consciousness altogether in this clinical complex case. So pharmacological therapy helped, especially in the acute phases, and contained the crisis and reduced the symptoms. However, medication did not solve the underlying existential despair or produce true transformation. Drugs treat brain chemistry, but neglect the deep yearning of the soul and the subjective path through suffering. While I continued to prescribe medication over the years, to which he was somewhat obsessively also attached, I knew that the main work lay in the therapeutic relationship. And there, my Freudian and Jungian training alone was not sufficient for effective intervention. Freud and Jung, as well as Assagioli, the founder of psychosynthesis, were pioneers, certainly in exploring psychological suffering in a way that included the meaning of mental distress. For example, Freud mapped the emergence of the ego and its defenses, denial, repression, projection, etc., and developed dream analysis as the royal road to the unconscious. He saw dreams as expression of denied wishes or unresolved conflicts, and so all this could be worked through. Jung broadened this to include archetypal and spiritual meanings, especially in psychotic situations, emphasizing his necessity of integrating the material that emerges when ego defenses collapse in neurosis and psychosis, and restoring a spiritual dimension to therapy. Though used alone, Freud and Jungian methods are incomplete from my point of view. They require integration with the transpersonal perspective. Analysis and interpretation by themselves too often fail to produce transformative death and rebirth experiences. To deepen understanding of these cases, we would now like to better explore the nature and multifactor origins of psychiatric crisis. Psychiatric crises arise from the interplay of psychodynamic, biological, environmental factors, certainly, but it is crucial to stress the role of transpersonal and spiritual dimension in psychiatric crisis. In particular, conscious awakening as a first root of the crisis and of the subsequent mental manifestations. Let's talk more then of this psychiatric crisis. And first, we will say that psychiatric crisis should be distinguished from a psychological crisis. First of all, the latter, the psychological one, involves ego discomfort, but not a true collapse of the ego. And the psychiatric crisis, conversely, is an irreversible, often catastrophic process. I view psychiatric crisis also as the fundamental building block for all psychiatric syndromes, which apparently are very different one from the other, but they all start with this process. It has been compared to the profound change that occurs in a childbirth. The act of coming into the light is really an irreversible and very important differentiation between just a discomfort being still in the womb of the mother. This is the same transformative process found, for example, in Jung's individuation, or in Divine Comedies, Dante's journey when he says, I found myself. That really is an awakening of the self to itself. The awakening of the self, realizing and becoming as one truly is. Know thyself, for example, was written on the Delphi in Greece, on the Delphi temple, is a universal goal across all traditions. And such awakening, a self-revelation of, or we could also say in our tradition, resurrection, is an irreversible process of psychological death and rebirth that propels individual consciousness into a new transpersonal, non-ordinary state of consciousness. So we would see, for example, these psychotic states as non-ordinary states of consciousness instead of saying a pathological state of consciousness. Yet this emergence is profoundly disruptive to the existing psychic balance, and the old separate identity must die for the new consciousness to be born. In the transpersonal model, this process can lead, depending on the individual's preparedness and openness to transformation or to the resistance to it, to very different outcomes, and very much depends also on the assistance that a transpersonal psychotherapist could give to this process. One could say that psychiatric practice involves managing failings in the natural process of awakening of these non-ordinary states of consciousness in people who are unprepared to integrate them. So, a process of awakening in unprepared people. And it manifests generally with three series of symptoms. On closer examination, we could distinguish identity crisis symptoms, like loss of one's former self, feelings of being lost, the depersonalization and derealization syndrome, apathy, confusion, loss of motivation, analogous to the infant's loss of secure belonging in childbirth, stepping into an open infinite space, which is the awakening condition. So this identity crisis symptoms. Then energetic symptoms, like the periodic propulsive drives akin to the energetic thrust of birth contractions, involves more physical symptoms on one side, like tachycardia, suffocation syndrome, vertigo, and tinnitus, and more psychic symptoms like fear, inner trembling, confusion. And these energetic symptoms arise from a surge of this energy, inner energy, which activates and passes through the subtle system, through the chakras and through the channels. And then we have a third series, like the egoic resistance symptoms, like the defensive reactions, while the individual ego stubbornly refuses to step aside, and manifesting as insistence on re-establishing even a negative identity, obsessive reaffirmation of one's story, leading to obsessive, avoidant, or panic disorder syndromes. So the panic disorder syndrome, the avoidance of the possibility of having a panic attack, is a resistance, an organization to resist to the process of the energetic and identity crisis. Much of psychiatry is preoccupied with these reactive symptoms. What was Jung's transpersonal perspective on all this? The transpersonal approach understands crisis not as a simple regression, but as a potentially initiatory passage and gateway to higher consciousness. The key is not merely suppressing or escaping through drugs or intellectual understanding, but supporting the patient in overcoming ego identification. Dreams of destruction and renewal, for example, can be reinterpreted as energy cycles of death and rebirth occurring in the now. When acute crisis knocks down ego defenses and unconscious material surges forth, transpersonal method reframes this not as a pathology, but as a gateway, encouraging conscious navigation with spiritual support. This doesn't mean that all navigations end well, but it must be understood what it is about. So you have to help this navigation. And in this clinical example that I gave, my patient with persistent depression found greater relief through sessions which fostered energetic shifts, non-dual awareness, and guided involvement with spiritual energies and archetypes rather than just analyzing his defenses. The transpersonal approach and training for the new therapist, for the modern therapist, must move then beyond merely solving personal problems, helping so to activate consciousness, guiding the patients from the ego to the self. And it must see crisis suffering as necessary to transformation, to this death and rebirth process, to be patiently contained and accompanied rather than just pathologized. In the transpersonal approach, the therapist's role is radically transformed from a fixer or interpreter to an initiator, to a companion, to a midwife of consciousness. Practice here is centered on real-time energetic awareness. Therapeutic focus on chakras and somatic sensations in the shared field, recognizing shifts in energetic meaning during and beyond verbal narrative. For example, the therapist leads the patient's attention into present moment energetic transformation. He can feel this, and the patient also can feel this, validating thus real change through both the body and relational field, and not merely through the verbal side, the storytelling. In clinical application, this results in a synergy between jungian and transpersonal methods. The jungian path toward individuation, that is going beyond the ego, is actualized in crisis intervention, while work on dreams as energetic and transformative, not just analytical examination, can accelerate and stabilize healing. Archetypes become guides. Example, a patient's dream of catastrophic collapse can be reframed as an archetypal death and rebirth process and can become a way to engage into new energetic and spiritual resources and not just analytical ones. So just to conclude, some reflections on the training, because classical psychotherapeutic training equips therapists to interpret and contain symptoms, while a transpersonal training could offer the capacity to accompany and awaken consciousness. Therapists in training must themselves experience non-ordinary states of consciousness to understand those happening in their patients. They should develop the sensitivity to energetic phenomena, and this can be done by all therapists with the right training, and adopt spiritual disciplines like meditation, mindful awareness, symbolic study. And only by going beyond the ego and directly experiencing these states can a therapist truly accompany a patient through transformation, for one cannot lead a patient beyond where he himself has gone. The future of crisis intervention sees transpersonal psychology, which was called the fourth force, not as an optional overlay, but as an evolutionary necessity of psychology and psychiatry. The therapy is called not to be merely a suppressor of suffering or decoder of meaning, but an authentic companion in transformative processes. Training courses should then provide to encourage a direct experience of transpersonal methods, include spiritual and energetic practices, integrate work on classic and archetypal dreams, and foster peer discussion of case studies. So, to conclude, true healing in psychiatric crisis arises from integration of body, mind, and spirit, and the collective archetypal dimensions. Freud and Jung laid the foundations, but transpersonal psychotherapy and psychiatry builds the bridge towards authentic awakening, creative transformation, and enduring freedom from suffering. Thank you very much for your attention, and goodbye.